You're watching NRATV with Bill Whittle.
God, I'm back. I'm home. All the time it was... We finally really did it. You maniacs! You blew it up! Oh, damn you! God damn you all to hell!
You maniacs! You blew it up! I'll leave the rest of it out. That was five-time NRA President Charlton Heston with the best twist ending of any movie of any time ever at the end of Planet of the Apes. And he realizes that people have destroyed the United States of America that he loves so much. And today, our topic is going to be basically that. You blew it up! You maniacs! We're going to talk about blowing up the Union. Because one of these things that just will not go away out here is the idea of California seceding from the Union. It has got actual traction out here, and enormous traction. Essentially really got started when Donald Trump was elected and the people of California decided that they wanted to have a hissy fit and take their soccer ball or go home because they don't have football. So let's talk about this. Now, I want to stress before we get going that this is all pure speculation and just for fun today, because the chance of this actually happening, I think, is pretty close to zero. It's not zero, but it's pretty close to zero. So let's talk about California secession. Now, Calexit, as the Sacramento Bee calls it, based on the takeoff on Brexit when the United Kingdom left the Union. There's an article about how another one of these plebiscites is going to come up, and they're going to proposition. We rule by proposition out here in California, by the way. And so the people who are pushing for an amendment to the California Constitution to get California out of the United States, as you can see there, they're confident about their latest plan that they're going to be able to get it and do it, put it on the ballot. And they seem to think that if they get it on the ballot and pass it, then that's the end of that. No, it's different than that. The story of secession and the legal basis of secession is really interesting. And one of the cases that's most interesting by far is that of Texas, because as Texans know, and they will remind you at every opportunity, Texas is the only state in the Union that was ever its own country, the Republic of Texas, before it joined the United States. So what's the legal ground for secession? If California really wanted to get out of the Union, let's say that a majority of Californians did it, what would the actual legal mechanics be? Well, if you go back to Texas, the idea of Texas leaving the USA, when asked about that subject, Scalia, who we all hold in very dear memory, had this to say. He said, if there was any constitutional issue resolved by the Civil War, it's that there is no right to secede. And that's Antonin Scalia talking. So the question is, what can happen and what can legally happen and what might happen and what's fair speculation and what's just plain lunacy? Hard to tell sometimes out here in the Golden State. But before we talk about that, we'll talk about how we got there, because if it's taken seriously, this issue, the question would be, would the United States send in troops to force California back into the Union, or would the United States send in troops to force California out of the Union? That's the question that nobody seems to have the answer for. We'll get back to that when we get to our guest in just a little minute. But let me just say this before we go on. I'm glad that California is talking about seceding from the Union. I'm glad that Texas is talking about it. And the reason I'm glad is because whether they know it or not, the progressives, at least in California, who are behind this measure, are coming back to the entire idea of federalism that the United States was based on in the first place. And so just the fact that this has come into their heads, that states have their own rights and their own borders and their own customs and so on, I think is a very healthy thing for America, because these people don't have a clue. So let's just talk very briefly, a quick little history lesson about how we got here. The federal government is way too big. It's just too big. All of the problems with it, you can ascribe to it being too big. It's too expensive, it's too slow, it's too impersonal, it's all those things. It's too big. But the federal government was never, ever meant to be as large as it is now. Washington was always kind of an out-of-the-way, kind of a swamp suburb. And the big cities, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, Houston, Dallas, all those things, was where the real action is. But over time, more and more power has accrued in Washington, more and more power in the hands of the president. Congress gets less and less effective. And so we have a country that's way out of balance. How did we get to this point? Well, we got to this point in the end of the 1800s, early 1900s, and we can thank all of this mess, thank our progressive friends for all of this mess, because at the turn of the last century, America was experiencing its great experiment with progressivism. The progressive movement, you know, the one that they talk about as being the future, it's 100 years old, didn't work then either. But there was enough political power in there to pass 4 progressive amendments. One of them gave women the right to vote, yay. One of them repealed, one of them basically made it illegal to buy alcohol, boo. But the two that really put the pressure on the federal government, the ones that took the power away from the states and gave it to Washington, are the 16th and 17th Amendment. Let's start with the 17th Amendment first. The Constitution was written with a different way of providing senators than we have today. First of all, real quick, the whole reason we have a 2-house Congress, a Senate and a House of Representatives, is because of the problem that the founders faced when they were trying to write a constitution that all the states could agree with. And the problem was this: if you've got a big state like New York and you've got a tiny state like New Hampshire or Rhode Island, let's say, how do you set up a government that's fair to both of them? The people in New York can say, well, we have more population, so we should have more of a say in how the country's run. The people in Rhode Island say, well, in that case, why are we even here? We're going to be outvoted on everything we do. And so the genius of the founding fathers was to say, okay, we'll have it both ways. We're going to have the House of Representatives, which is determined by population. California is the biggest state. It provides the most representatives to the Congress. The House of Representatives represents the people of America based on their population distribution. But the Senate was supposed to be the House of the states. And originally in the Constitution, senators were not elected by the people. They were elected by the state legislatures. So it's a very important distinction, but it really, really matters. Prior to the 17th Amendment, which basically said the people shall elect senators, which makes them basically just super representatives, makes the Senate essentially a House of Lords. It's just another, higher level elite school that you have to pass. But originally, the whole idea was that since the state of Alabama, let's say, is going to send the 2 senators to the federal government, to the Senate, those 2 senators would look out for the interests not of the people of Alabama. That's what the House of Representatives is for. They would look out for the interests of the state of Alabama. As a state, they would protect each state's sovereign rights. So when the progressives got the 17th Amendment through, now all they had to do was win the popular vote, which means essentially the Senate is useless and the states don't have any leverage at all the way they were supposed to in the original Constitution. That's the 17th Amendment. 16th Amendment is another part of the problem, and the 16th Amendment essentially calls for an income tax, and it's just brutal. It's almost like a decree. Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived, without apportionment among the several states and without regard to any census or enumeration. So when you combine the 17th Amendment that takes the power away from the states and puts it in the hands of the federal government, and the 16th Amendment, which gives the income tax to the federal government, all of a sudden now you've got this monster in Washington where it was not supposed to be a monster in Washington. And so the idea that we would be talking about states leaving the Union is on some level getting back to the original intent and trying to find a better balance between states, local, and federal governments. So that's how we got into the mess we're in now. And to help us talk about a few ways maybe we could get out of it is our guest, Ed Brodow. He's a California analyst. He analyzes the state of California. He's a retired Marine. And he's author of a book, The Tyranny of the Minority, How the Left is Destroying America. Ed, thanks for joining us. Great to have you here today.
Good to be here.
Ed, it seems funny to people outside of the state of California, but there are people in California that are serious about the secession thing, aren't there?
Well, it's a kind of a juvenile way of looking at politics because they think they're doing the right thing, but they don't think about the consequences of their policies. That's the whole problem. Complete lack of concern for what happens afterwards.
So it's just basically, you think it's just a temper tantrum, essentially, is what they're throwing. They didn't like the way the election came out, so since they don't want Trump for president, they'll make their own country where Trump isn't president.
I think that's a large part of it, but it also goes back to the whole leftist approach, which is, let's give everything away. Let's have free education, free welfare, free this, free that, but nobody ever stops to say who's going to pay for it, and if we're going to have sanctuary cities, what's going to happen if the government no longer provides protection for its citizens? What's going to happen then? They don't think about the consequences.
No, obviously not. That's a really good point. And you know what's kind of surprising? I think what surprised most people, Ed, is if you take a look at California's electoral map from the 2016 election, if you look at how California voted in the last year, if you bring up that electoral map, you will see that California is in many ways a very red state. If we can get that graphic up there, we'd certainly be able. There it is. You can see that huge swaths of California are red. The entire interior of the state is red. You got a lot of blue up at San Francisco and blue in Los Angeles and a little blue down in San Diego. So I think that's. Do you think that this would be the California conservatives, the people who voted Republican and made that middle of the state red, do you think they would go for this secession thing?
Absolutely not. And I'm one of those people. And frankly, I resent the fact that my vote is in effect effectless. I mean, my vote is wasted because it's all or nothing in this state. So if you have 5 million people voting, and 2.5 million plus 1 vote blue, then the 2.5 million minus 1 who didn't vote for it, their vote is invalidated.
It's funny you mention that because a lot of conservatives have been saying if California left the Union, then the Democrats would never win a national election again. Now, I want to stress that I'm not 100% certain of the statistical methods that we used on this, but just as a quick experiment, I asked one of the really bright guys that works here with me, I said, can you take a look at the last 5 presidential election cycles and remove California from them? What would happen? And the results are actually really interesting. Just very briefly, it turns out that, where are we? There would be no change in the actual results. The Electoral College, even with the reduced Electoral College, with California gone, you wouldn't need 270, you'd only need 242, the way we analyze it. But the elections would stay the same. But one very interesting thing would be different if California was gone. And that is that George Bush winning in 2000 and Donald Trump winning in 2016, if California had left the Union, both of those presidents would have won the popular vote by a significant majority. And the entire idea to delegitimize both Trump and Bush by saying that they lost the popular vote wouldn't have happened. These people know what they're doing, don't they, Ed? When well, he didn't win the popular vote, so he's not really our president. They know how the Electoral College works. Why do you think they keep blowing that horn?
Well, they were expecting that Hillary was going to win the Electoral College. I remember that. They were all saying, she's going to wipe them out in the Electoral College. And I think they were shocked when it didn't happen. So if it wasn't that, it'd be something else. It's just that the left in this country is, as you say, they're having a temper tantrum. They don't want to accept that Trump is our legitimate president, elected legitimately and they want to try to destroy it any way they can.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, Ed. Stick with us after the break. We're going to come back and talk about, again, it's all speculation, but it's kind of fun, and it is actual news out here in California. We'll talk about how it would actually happen if California decided to leave the union, what the consequences might be, and how they would do it, and would it be a loud thing or a quiet thing? We'll get to the answers of all of that when we come back in about 2 minutes. This is the Hot Mic Show here on NRATV.